I've seen a lot of horrific mountain videos online, but nothing prepared me for what these people actually did on some of the deadliest peaks in the world. From a climber who chose a faster route beneath a massive wall of unstable ice, to a group that kept pushing higher even after the mountain started warning them. This is Alex, and welcome to The Last Climb. It was April 22nd, 2014, in the Everest Base Camp area of Tibet. Light snow the previous night had left a fresh dusting on the slopes. An expedition company was running practice climbs before the main summit window opened. Griffin Hartley was 36, a guide hired weeks earlier to lead clients on the North Route. His application listed nearly a dozen Everest summits and extensive credentials. The company paid him at the higher end of the rate scale. In the mid-2000s, verification was done through personal references and self-reported experience. What the company never discovered was that Griffin had summited Everest only once, years earlier, as a paying client, not a guide. He had led trips on lower mountains, but had fabricated most of his Everest experience. He gave convincing answers drawn from publicly available reports. His deception had worked on previous contracts. Griffin was assigned to take 2 clients, both experienced trekkers but new to extreme altitude, on a training rotation to an intermediate camp. The plan was to climb up, acclimatize, then descend the same day. Griffin had been to that elevation only once before. The route involved steep ice faces with fixed ropes and exposed traverses subject to high winds. Weather on the north side often deteriorated in afternoons. Griffin and his 2 clients, Claire Avery and Tom Ochoa, left the lower camp in the morning. Claire carried a helmet camera to document her first high-altitude climb. The climb to their target elevation normally took several hours. Griffin set a pace faster than typical acclimatization protocol, saying they needed to get down before afternoon weather moved in. His clients kept up, but were breathing hard well before reaching the destination. They arrived at the campsite around midday. Griffin's plan had them resting briefly, then heading down within an hour. Both clients were showing altitude effects: headaches, nausea, moving slowly. Claire asked to rest longer. Griffin contacted Base Camp on the radio, reporting his clients needed more time. Base Camp advised waiting until the symptoms eased, suggesting a departure in the mid-afternoon. By early afternoon, winds had picked up considerably. Griffin decided to descend anyway, against Base Camp recommendations. His clients trusted his claimed expertise and followed. The descent required careful movement down steep ice with the fixed rope as a safety line. Partway down, Claire slipped on a steep section and caught herself on the rope but became tangled and couldn't get her footing back. Griffin, below her, climbed back up to help. Other climbers ascending the route stopped and filmed the situation on their phones. Standard practice for documenting technical problems. The footage captured Griffin's repeated failed attempts to untangle Claire, trying different approaches that an experienced guide would know were incorrect. He fumbled with the rope configuration for several minutes while Claire hung awkwardly. When Claire was finally back en route, the delay had cost them. Winds were stronger and visibility was getting worse. Griffin pushed for faster movement. Tom began showing serious altitude sickness, vomiting, and confusion. Griffin radioed Base Camp asking what to do. Base Camp told him to descend immediately and support Tom as best he could. A short time later, Tom collapsed on the slope. Griffin and Claire tried to help him, but got no response. Griffin called for emergency assistance. A rescue team was dispatched from below, but would need over an hour to reach them. Griffin's radio communications over the next period were later reviewed. He reported Tom's condition worsening and said he couldn't move him alone. Base Camp instructed Griffin to stay with Tom, while Claire descended on her own for safety. Griffin sent Claire down. She reached the lower camp after dark. With assistance from the rescue team, she met partway. The rescue team found Tom unresponsive in the early evening. Griffin was showing hypothermia and exhaustion. They confirmed Tom had died and evacuated his body the next morning. The incident prompted the company to verify Griffin's background when they reviewed Claire's helmet camera footage and videos from other climbers. The recordings showed Griffin's handling of the rope emergency, his uncertainty, incorrect techniques, and trial and error approach visible in detail. An experienced climber who had filmed the rope incident submitted his footage, noting Griffin's methods seemed amateur. Cross-checking his claimed summit dates against records confirmed only his single client summit from years before. Medical examination determined Tom had died from brain swelling caused by altitude sickness, worsened by extended exposure during delayed descent. Reviewers noted the camera evidence revealed critical decision-making failures, the premature departure during building winds, the rope handling incompetence, and delayed recognition of Tom's deteriorating condition. The footage contradicted Griffin's claimed expertise at every turn. His certifications were pulled, and he was removed from the guide registry. It was February 9th, 2026, in a gully approach route leading toward a high-altitude mountain camp on an 8,000-meter peak. Overnight wind had deposited smooth, hollow-sounding snowdrifts inside the channel, creating classic wind slab, avalanche conditions along the slope. Navid Lorne was 33 years old, a radiology technologist from a mountain city in Western Canada. His professional work with medical imaging had trained him to recognize subtle pattern abnormalities and structural irregularity. He trained during winter seasons on mountain ranges in his region and developed conservative instincts regarding avalanche terrain. This was his first expedition to a major 8,000-meter mountain. Navid and his climbing partner were tasked with establishing a supply cache at a high intermediate camp before returning the same day. Despite visible wind loading in the central gully, he continued forward, traveling alone without probing the snow surface for stability. The route followed a moderately steep snow gully between rock ridges leading toward the high camp platform. Recent snowfall and strong winds had formed wind-drifted snow slabs resting over weaker layers below. The temperature remained well below freezing, with blowing snow visible along higher ridges. The primary danger was a poorly bonded wind slab that could release under a small trigger. Base staging communication had already issued warnings regarding wind loading risk. Another team delayed their carry mission after hearing settlement noises and observing small cracking sounds during snow pole tests. Risk increased when Navid moved slightly left to bypass a small rock outcrop. This shift placed him onto a smoother, thicker slab, showing classic wind deposition characteristics. Rather than retreating downslope to safer terrain, he moved quickly across the section, taking several rapid steps in the belief that reducing time on the slope would reduce exposure. His partner waited in a sheltered position roughly a short distance below, maintaining visual contact as the slope surface became quieter and more compacted under Navid's weight. The avalanche released near the middle of the gully below the high camp platform. At approximately mid-morning, a weak layer beneath a wind slab, roughly 1 foot thick, collapsed at a convex rollover zone. A sharp cracking sound was followed by a low whoomph sensation as the slab fractured. The crown opened across a wide horizontal line, and the snow mass began accelerating downslope immediately. Navid was knocked off balance and carried with the moving debris. Witnesses reported he attempted swimming motions toward the surface while blocks of consolidated snow moved over him. His arm was visible twice during the descent, as he fought to remain above the moving debris field. The avalanche traveled down a narrowing chute, gaining speed across a long vertical drop, before depositing into a debris zone far below the release point. He was carried a long distance downslope and buried beneath dense avalanche debris. The burial depth was significant enough to compress the chest region and fill the airway with snow. External bleeding was not observed during recovery. The slide duration was brief, followed by silence except for blowing wind as hypoxia under compact debris likely caused loss of consciousness within minutes. The partner immediately initiated an avalanche beacon search and probe line while radioing the main staging camp. Communication was maintained through relay radio channels and later satellite contact. Search assistance arrived after some time from personnel stationed lower on the route. Response speed was limited by secondary release risk and difficult movement through unstable debris. Navid was located using an avalanche transceiver within a short search interval. Extrication required additional minutes, but he showed no pulse or spontaneous breathing when reached. Medical assessment identified asphyxia due to avalanche burial as the primary cause of death, with contributing factors including wind slab relief, chest compression from debris loading, and rapid oxygen deprivation. Recovered evidence included crown fracture photographs, snow layer analysis showing a hard slab resting over weak faceted snow, and a helmet surface showing minor abrasion consistent with debris tumbling. The incident was mentioned briefly in expedition bulletins and regional mountain community notices. Following the accident, climbing groups shifted route preference to a ridge-based line, avoiding the gully corridor, and delayed supply carries until wind slab layers had more time to stabilize. It was May 11, 2016, on the southern route of Mount Everest. The campsite consisted of dozens of tents arranged in clusters by expedition group, connected by paths stamped into the snow. Climbers moved between tents in the late afternoon, preparing gear and resting before the next rotation up the mountain. Jolene Harwood, 41, worked in real estate development and had paid for a guided expedition after completing a single mountaineering course in Colorado 6 months prior. She arrived in Nepal with climbing gear purchased online, including a harness system, carabiners, and ascending devices that cost roughly 40% less than equipment sold by the expedition outfitter. When other climbers asked about her gear during the trek to base camp, Harwood indicated she had done extensive research and found equivalent quality at better prices. During the mandatory gear inspection at base camp, the lead guide identified that Harwood's harness was a recreational sport climbing model designed for gym use and single-pitch routes. The belay loop was thinner than mountaineering standards, and the stitching was lighter weight than expedition-grade harnesses built for multi-week use under heavy loads. The guide recommended she purchase a replacement from the outfitter's supply for $280. Harwood refused, pointing to the UIAA safety certification on the label, and suggesting the guide was attempting to upsell unnecessary equipment. Over the following 2 weeks, Harwood's harness showed visible wear on the belay loop stitching. The fabric had begun to fray where it looped through the waist belt connection point. Another climber pointed this out at Camp 1, and a Sherpa raised the same concern on the climb to Camp 2. On both occasions, Harwood inspected the harness briefly and dismissed the concern, attributing it to normal abrasion and asserting she was capable of recognizing genuinely damaged equipment. She did not report the wear to the guides or request a replacement. On May 10th, the team moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet in preparation for the summit push. During the final equipment check, the expedition leader examined Harwood's harness and noted the fraying had progressed significantly, with multiple strands of the belay loop now visibly separated. He strongly recommended she use a backup harness from the emergency supply. Harwood declined, stating the harness had supported her weight throughout the expedition, and expressing unwillingness to switch to unfamiliar equipment at that stage. The summit team departed Camp 4 at 10:45 p.m. on May 10th. Harwood climbed in the middle of the group, clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope as the route zigzagged up the southeast ridge. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds averaging 15 miles per hour. At 27,900 feet, the team reached the Hillary Step, a near-vertical 40-foot rock face requiring climbers to ascend using the fixed line and jamars. At 5:50 a.m., with the sky beginning to lighten, Harwood clipped her ascender to the rope and began the climb. She moved slowly, pulling herself upward in short bursts while other climbers waited below on the narrow ridge. Halfway up, at approximately 18 feet above the slope below, she stopped to rest and leaned back, transferring her full weight onto the harness. At 6:02 a.m., the belay loop separated from the waist belt with a sharp tearing sound. The stitching had ripped completely through the connection point. Harwood dropped backward, ascender still attached to the fixed rope, but no longer connected to her body. She tumbled past the waiting climber and fell down the exposed rock and ice face below. Her body came to rest approximately 200 feet below, on a steep snow slope angled at 55 degrees. Two guides descended from their positions and reached her location 30 minutes later. Harwood was face down in the snow, unresponsive, with no pulse or breathing. Her helmet had been knocked from her head during the fall and was located 40 feet upslope. The guides documented the scene and examined the separated harness, which remained clipped to the rope by the ascender. The belay loop had detached completely at the buckle junction, with thread bundles fully separated after weeks of repeated loading cycles. The investigation concluded that Harwood died from massive trauma sustained during the fall, including skull fractures, cervical spine damage, and severe internal injuries. The harness failure was attributed to using recreational-grade equipment for multi-week expedition climbing, a use category its UIAA certification did not cover. The visible fraying had progressed through the stitching layers until complete structural failure occurred under load. Harwood had been warned about the deteriorating equipment on 4 separate occasions and declined to replace it each time. Her body was recovered over 3 days before helicopter evacuation from 26,500 feet. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from equipment failure after repeated refusal to replace visibly compromised gear. It was October 12th, 2017, on a rugged alpine traverse high on Mount Everest's northern mountain system. The day began with clear skies and light autumn wind along an exposed ridgeline above the established high camps. Within a few hours, weather conditions changed sharply, turning the routine traverse into a struggle against violent winds above the tree line. Tony Amiel was 41, a teacher from a northern city who had more than 15 years of hiking experience in mountain regions. He had completed several long alpine traverses before and was known among companions for strong endurance and fast pacing. The intended route spanned a long, exposed corridor across multiple high-altitude peaks, with extended sections where natural shelter from wind and cold was absent. Amiel planned to complete the traverse within a single day, aiming to finish before the season's first major storm system reached the upper mountain. Weather advisories warned that wind speeds would increase during the day. Despite the warning, he began hiking, wearing light, movement-efficient clothing suited for rapid travel. Conditions worsened as he advanced along the ridgeline. Other climbers reported seeing him moving steadily across open mountain sections, while cloud cover thickened across surrounding peaks. Wind strength had already become sufficient to move loose gravel across bare rock surfaces, creating unstable footing for hikers carrying equipment. He sent a final communication stating that wind conditions were becoming more severe, but that he intended to continue. Afterward, he entered an exposed saddle section, consisting of wide granite slabs bordered by steep, unprotected drop zones. As the day progressed, wind gusts intensified to levels commonly associated with extreme alpine storm systems. Such wind speeds are capable of destabilizing a standing climber, particularly when moving across ice-slickened rock while carrying a backpack. The combination of wind pressure and uneven terrain caused repeated loss of balance. Witnesses later observed the climber being pushed off the marked path several times by strong sideways wind forces, requiring significant effort each time to regain footing before moving forward. Shortly afterward, a powerful wind surge swept across the ridge corridor. The granite surface had developed a thin layer of ice formed from moisture freezing under continuous cold airflow. The exposed slab section had no rope protection, vegetation, or nearby rock formations capable of reducing wind impact. The terrain provided very little friction, making stable movement increasingly difficult. The climber was eventually knocked to the ground by wind force. Search personnel later identified scrape marks and displaced gravel near the trail boundary, suggesting multiple attempts to stand while maintaining balance. An ice axe was recovered downslope with deep scoring on the blade edge, consistent with repeated contact against bare rock during attempts to slow a downward slide. The terrain near the drainage slope descends sharply into fractured granite walls and stacked rock ledges. Once momentum developed on the ice-covered stone surface, controlling downward movement became extremely difficult. The climber was carried toward the cliff boundary and fell a significant vertical distance down the rocky drainage zone, striking multiple protruding rock formations during the descent. Emergency response teams were notified immediately, but sustained high winds made helicopter access unsafe. Ground search teams waited until wind strength decreased later that night before beginning recovery operations. The approach to the ravine area required cautious movement across unstable mountain terrain. The climber was located several hundred feet below the trail in a rocky drainage valley. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from the fall, with hypothermia and prolonged environmental exposure as contributing factors. The incident was later used in mountain safety education programs to illustrate how rapid weather changes in high-altitude environments can transform ordinary traverses into life-threatening situations within a short time. On Everest's upper mountains, open ridges, extreme wind exposure, and ice formation can quickly eliminate safe movement margins. It was February 14, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges. Visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience and relied entirely on previous mild-season guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, the body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. The date was May 3, 2018, in the Khumbu Icefall on Mount Everest. The morning sun had been heating the glacier for nearly 3 hours, softening the ice that held massive seracs in place and increasing the likelihood of collapse with each passing minute. The icefall doctors had closed the passage at 9 o'clock sharp, as they did every day when temperatures rose above the safety threshold. Climbers who hadn't completed their crossings were required to wait until the following night, when the cold would refreeze the ice and restore a margin of safety. 31-year-old Thomas Eriksson had missed the window. He was a commercial client from Norway who had paid a substantial sum for a guided Everest attempt, his first expedition to the Himalayas. Thomas was fit, motivated, and deeply frustrated by what he perceived as excessive caution. The icefall closure seemed arbitrary to him, a bureaucratic restriction that prioritized liability over achievement. His expedition leader had been clear: no one was to enter the icefall after the closure. The seracs were unstable, the ladders were shifting, and the consequences of a collapse were unsurvivable. Thomas nodded during the briefing, then returned to his tent and began preparing his gear. He planned to cross alone and reach Camp 1 before anyone realized he was gone. In his mind, the closure was a guideline for slower climbers, not an absolute rule for someone who could move quickly through technical terrain. He entered the icefall around 11 in the morning, nearly 2 hours after the official closure. The route wound between towering seracs, some larger than buildings, their surfaces groaning and cracking as the sun heated the ice. The sound was constant, a low, irregular popping, like distant gunfire, as ice adjusted to the warming air. The ladders spanning the deepest crevasses flexed under his weight, their aluminum rungs already warm to the touch. Thomas moved quickly, his focus narrowed to the path ahead. Sweat gathered beneath his helmet despite the altitude, and his breathing grew ragged in the thin air. The first warning came as a sound, a deep, resonant crack that echoed through the icefall like a gunshot. Thomas froze, scanning the seracs for movement. Nothing seemed different. He waited 30 seconds, then resumed climbing faster than before. The second warning came as a vibration. The ice beneath his crampons shuddered briefly, a tremor passing through the glacier like a wave. He looked up at the nearest serac, a massive pillar of blue ice leaning slightly toward the route. A fresh crack had appeared near its base, a dark line running horizontally across the surface. The pillar was shifting. He should have run. Instead, he hesitated. The ladder crossing ahead was only 50 feet away, and beyond it lay a more stable zone. Thomas calculated he could make it across before anything happened. The calculation took 3 seconds. The serac took 2. The collapse began at the top. A house-sized chunk of ice separated from the main pillar and dropped straight down, shattering on impact and sending fragments spinning in every direction. The rest of the serac followed a moment later, toppling forward in a cascade that accelerated as it fell. Thomas ran. His crampons tore at the ice. His arms pumped. His lungs screamed for air. But the icefall was faster. The debris caught him from behind. Blocks of ice ranging from the size of televisions to cars swept through the route, obliterating ladders, filling crevasses, and burying everything in their path. Thomas was struck by a fragment that spun him sideways, then engulfed by the main flow. The noise was overwhelming, a roar that drowned out everything else. Then silence. Sherpas at base camp heard the collapse and radioed the icefall doctors. A rescue team assembled within the hour, but the debris field was too unstable to approach. They waited until late afternoon before picking through the wreckage. Thomas was found near the center, partially buried beneath blocks that had crushed everything around them. His injuries were catastrophic and instantaneous. The investigation confirmed what everyone already knew. Thomas had entered the icefall after closure, ignored multiple warnings, and been killed when a serac collapsed onto the route. His expedition issued a statement emphasizing he had acted against explicit instructions. The icefall doctors reinforced their protocols. But in the Khumbu icefall, where the ice never stopped shifting and the seracs never stopped falling, the lesson was already plain. The closure existed because the mountain didn't negotiate. It didn't care about ambition or frustration or money. It only cared about physics, about the weight of ice and the weakness of flesh, and about the immutable fact that some rules couldn't be broken without consequences. It was the 6th of August, 2015, and the gales over Camp 4 had at last died down to survivable strength. The weather window had cracked open just far enough for one final push, and 12 mountaineers from 4 distinct expeditions were preparing to gamble everything on it. The thermometer at 25,900 feet sat around minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to inhibit surface melt, but not cold enough to halt the immense pressures accumulating inside the glacier. The sky was crystalline, the stars fierce and unwavering above, their brilliance undiminished by the razor-thin atmosphere. But farther down the slope, the standard bottleneck corridor was already jammed with over 40 climbers from commercial teams and independent parties. Their headlamps strung out in a creeping ribbon of light that promised hours of dangerous waiting beneath the looming seracs. On K2, crowding isn't just an annoyance, it's fatal. Unlike Everest, there's no room to step out of the way, no sheltered perches to pause on, and no tolerance for delays. Every climber stuck in that procession would be standing motionless beneath overhanging ice, unable to move in either direction without the cooperation of everyone else on the line. In past seasons, teams had been stalled in the bottlenecks so long that nightfall arrived before they could descend, converting successful summit bids into desperate overnight survival struggles. Nobody at Camp 4 needed reminding that standing still on K2 was often deadlier than climbing. Among the 12 gathered at Camp 4 was Marcus Holt, a 44-year-old Canadian expedition leader carrying 23 years of high-altitude experience. Marcus had topped 6 of the 14 8,000-meter peaks, including Annapurna and Nanga Parbat, mountains that required surgical skill and unflinching judgment. He ran a small guiding outfit from Vancouver that specialized in measured, ego-free decision-making, expeditions grounded in meticulous preparation, disciplined turnaround times, and an absolute rejection of summit fever. His clients trusted him precisely because he had walked away from summits before, sometimes tantalizingly close to the top, whenever conditions or timing called for retreat. He had turned around on Makalu in 2009 when his instincts told him the weather forecast was off, a decision that almost certainly saved lives when a storm arrived far earlier than anyone expected. K2 was his great obsession, the one summit that had defeated him twice before because of weather. This was his third attempt, and he had built a team tailored specifically for the August window, when the mountain typically offered its most workable conditions. His team included Kira Jensen, a 25-year-old Norwegian climber whose swift ascent through the mountaineering ranks had drawn comparisons to the sport's finest talents. Kira had summited Everest at 21, Lhotse at 22, and Broad Peak just 3 months before reaching K2's base camp. She moved with a precision that more experienced climbers found almost unnerving. Never a wasted gesture, never a needless pause, always plotting her next sequence. She had grown up in Tromsø, honing her skills on frozen waterfalls through the long Arctic night, building a deep instinct for ice structure that proved vital at extreme altitude. But beneath that mechanical efficiency was something her teammates had noticed during the acclimatization weeks, a craving for recognition that occasionally overruled her natural caution. She had brought up more than once that K2 would make her the youngest Norwegian woman to complete 4 8,000-meter summits. The milestone mattered to her, perhaps more than it should have. Sharing a tent close by were Sofia and Daniel Ruiz, a Spanish couple who had been climbing together for 15 years. Sofia was 37, a former competitive ski racer who had moved to mountaineering after a knee injury finished her racing career. Daniel was 39, an architect by profession who designed buildings in the cold months and spent every summer in the mountains with his wife. They had met on Aconcagua in 2003, married at Everest Base Camp in 2009, and constructed their whole relationship around shared summits. Their climbing bond was built on near telepathic understanding. They could relay entire plans with a look, coordinate movements without words, and predict each other's needs before speech was required. K2 was supposed to be their farewell expedition, one final major ascent before starting the family they had been putting off for years. Sofia had told another climber during the approach march that she was already 3 weeks late for her period and suspected she might be pregnant. She had chosen not to take a test until after the summit. The mountain, she believed, would give her a sign one way or another. The fourth expedition at Camp 4 was led by Pemba Tshering, a 41-year-old Sherpa with 16 Everest summits and vast experience across the Himalaya and Karakoram ranges. Pemba had evolved from working for Western outfitters to running his own selective operation, guiding chosen clients on peaks where his expertise could mean the difference between success and disaster. His reputation for composure under pressure was legendary. He had coordinated numerous high-altitude rescues and was known for an almost uncanny ability to read ice conditions. He could examine a serac wall from hundreds of feet away and spot fracture patterns that other guides missed entirely. With him were 2 clients, Thomas Varga, a 52-year-old Czech industrialist on his 7th 8,000-meter peak, and Henrik Larsson, a 34-year-old Swedish photographer documenting the expedition for a European outdoor magazine. The remaining climbers came from a loose alliance of independent alpinists who had joined forces for convenience. Yuki Tanaka, 29, from Japan, Alexei Volkov, 38, from Russia, and 2 Pakistani high-altitude porters, Karim Shah and Imran Hussain, both seasoned K2 veterans who understood the mountain's temperament better than most outsiders ever could. Karim had grown up in Skardu, watching K2 from his family's home, learning its weather rhythms and hazard zones from elders who had worked on expeditions across decades. Tales from the historic climbs, names like the Italian expedition of 1954 and the early American efforts that preceded it, had been handed down in Skardu for generations, shaping Karim's grasp of the mountain's nature. His own father had worked the route through the 1970s and 1980s, watching seracs calve without warning and whole expeditions disappear beneath them. The mountain's duplicity, its sudden ferocity, its total indifference to human aspiration, these truths were woven into Karim's instincts. As the 12 climbers prepared to leave Camp 4 shortly past midnight, they confronted an immediate problem. Radio chatter confirmed what their own eyes could see. The traditional bottleneck was gridlocked. Teams that had departed hours earlier were reporting waits of 3 to 4 hours simply to clear the most dangerous section, with climbers stacked above and below the fixed ropes in a formation that practically invited disaster. Every minute spent stationary under the seracs was another minute for the mountain to strike. Marcus assembled the other team leaders for a discussion that would determine everything that followed. Their options were narrow: join the queue and accept the exposure, turn back and abandon the summit bid, or consider the West Ridge Traverse, an alternate line that bypassed the traditional bottleneck by cutting across a steep face beneath a different serac band. The Traverse had been used with success in 2011 by a small expedition, but had fallen out of favor due to concerns about the stability of the ice overhead. No confirmed successful party had used it since 2012. Pemba knew the route. He had studied it at length during his earlier K2 expeditions, and had spoken with climbers who had completed it successfully. The Traverse was longer than the direct bottleneck approach, roughly 400 horizontal feet of technical climbing across mixed ice and rock, but it allowed them to avoid the worst of the bottleneck congestion on the ascent and reach the upper route without hours of stationary exposure. The serac above the Traverse was enormous, a wall of ice perhaps 300 feet tall that overhung the route at a 15-degree angle. Pemba noted that temperatures had held relatively cold most nights that week, and they saw no obvious fresh collapse scars and heard nothing that indicated active movement overnight. From their limited perspective, it appeared calm enough that they talked themselves into accepting the risk. The decision was not unanimous. Karim Shah raised concerns, citing his father's stories about the West Ridge seracs, how they broke apart without warning, how entire expeditions had disappeared under them. The elder Shah had carried porter loads on K2 in the 1970s and 1980s, back when parties were smaller and more cautious, and he had witnessed events that unsettled younger guides. But the majority supported the Traverse. The calculation seemed straightforward: 4 hours of stationary exposure in the bottleneck queue set against 90 minutes for the Traverse crossing, assuming the rope fixing went well. Movement was always safer than standing still. They departed Camp 4 at 1:15 in the morning, crampons crunching into frozen snow as they climbed toward the junction point where the routes diverged. The night was viciously cold but still, the sort of conditions that lent K2 an almost benevolent quality. Marcus led the first rope team, with Kira directly on his heels. Pemba anchored the second team, placing Sophia and Daniel in the center where he could monitor their pace. The remaining climbers spread across 2 additional rope teams, spacing themselves to prevent bunching. By 5:30 in the morning, following an existing trail and old fixed lines where they could, they had reached the Traverse Junction at approximately 27,200 feet. The traditional bottleneck was visible below and to their right, still choked with headlamps moving at a glacial pace. Above them, the West Ridge Traverse cut across the face like a narrow shelf, the ice wall towering overhead in the pre-dawn darkness. From this angle, the serac appeared enormous, a frozen wave suspended mid-crash, its leading edge protruding out over the path they were about to take. Pemba moved to the front and began fixing the initial section of rope. The Traverse required horizontal movement across terrain that sloped downward at roughly 30 degrees, with few opportunities for protection. Each placement had to be verified with careful body weight before anyone relied on it. The anchors were tested with gentle, steady pressure that wouldn't shock load the marginal ice. The work was slow and deliberate, exactly the kind of technical climbing that separated K2 from the guided conveyor belts on Everest. The ice quality varied enormously across the face, from solid névé to brittle wind crust that shattered at the slightest touch. Pemba had to choose each anchor placement with extreme care, searching for the sweet spot where the ice had enough density to hold a screw, but wasn't so brittle that the first turns would dinner plate and weaken the placement. By 9:45 in the morning, later than anyone had hoped, the first rope team had completed the traverse. Marcus radioed back that conditions were stable, the anchors were holding, and the route above the traverse appeared clear. The message sent relief rippling through the remaining climbers. They had made the right call. The sun was fully up now, its heat beginning to soften the ice above them. This was the critical window, the hours between sunrise and early afternoon, when solar radiation loosened the bonds holding the seracs together. Experienced mountaineers knew to clear exposed terrain before the warming intensified. Everyone on the traverse understood this. Everyone was moving as fast as the technical ground allowed. At 10:30, Sophia and Daniel reached the midpoint of the traverse, approximately 200 feet from either end. They were clipped into a fixed rope that Pemba had anchored at both ends, their bodies pressed against the ice wall as they shuffled sideways with careful, methodical movements. Daniel was in front, reaching back periodically to touch Sophia's hand, a small gesture of connection they had built over years of climbing together. Behind them, Thomas Varga was laboring at the altitude, his pace lagging behind the others, his breathing audible even through his regulator. At 10:47, the first piece of the serac broke away. The sound arrived before the sight, a crack so deep and resonant that it seemed to originate from the mountain's interior. Sophia looked up and saw a section of ice the size of a small building detach from the main serac face and begin to fall. The trajectory was impossible to gauge in the sliver of a second she had. She flattened herself against the rock, mouth open in a silent reflex, eyes fixed on Daniel. The ice hit the traverse approximately 80 feet ahead of their position, exactly where the exit ropes connected to the completed section. The impact was devastating. Anchors torn from the wall, fixed ropes severed instantly, and two climbers who had been waiting at the exit point were swept off the face without a sound. Yuki Tanaka and Alexei Volkov disappeared into the void below, their bodies cartwheeling through thousands of feet before vanishing into cloud. The debris zone spread across the traverse, showering the remaining climbers with chunks of ice ranging from fist-sized to the size of large appliances. Daniel threw his body across Sophia, shielding her head with his arms as fragments of ice hammered his back and shoulders. The bombardment lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though it felt like hours. When it stopped, the silence was total. Marcus, who had already crossed the traverse, looked back to assess the damage. The exit ropes were gone. A 40-foot section of the traverse itself had been destroyed, replaced by a vertical scar of exposed rock that offered no passage. 8 climbers were now stranded on the middle section of the traverse. Sophia, Daniel, Tomas, Pemba, Kira, Henrik, Karim, and Imran, with no route forward. The entrance ropes were still in place. Marcus radioed for the stranded climbers to reverse course and retreat the way they had come. But as Pemba started organizing the retreat, a second crack resounded across the face. This collapse was smaller, but more precisely aimed. A shelf of ice approximately 60 feet wide separated from the serac and fell directly onto the entrance section of the traverse, destroying the anchors that Pemba had placed just hours before. The ropes that linked the stranded climbers to safety dropped into the abyss, their severed ends swinging uselessly against the rock face. The traverse had become a sealed corridor, 400 feet of narrow ice shelf hanging 27,000 feet above sea level, blocked at both ends by impassable debris, with 300 feet of unstable ice suspended directly overhead. 8 climbers were trapped with limited oxygen, nothing reliable enough for a controlled rappel into terrain that would probably kill them anyway. The serac had just demonstrated its willingness to collapse. Pemba took command immediately. His voice over the radio was calm and clinical as he assessed resources and weighed options. Each climber had between 4 and 6 hours of supplemental oxygen remaining, though some were already conserving aggressively, dropping to minimum flow whenever they could manage it. The ice tools they carried could potentially be used to create new anchor points, but the rock beneath the ice layer was rotten and fractured, unsuitable for reliable protection. The only feasible option was to wait for the serac to stabilize and attempt to climb directly up the debris field at the exit point, creating a new route to the completed section above. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in high-altitude survival. Pemba and Karim worked together to rig a temporary anchor system. Marginal placements meant only to slow a fall, not stop one. The stranded climbers minimized movement, maintaining spacing where possible and shifting only enough to avoid loading any single screw. Sophia and Daniel pressed together in a shallow hollow where the ice wall provided minimal protection from overhead debris. Kira positioned herself near the exit debris, studying the wrecked terrain for possible passage. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the Serac shifted again. This time, there was no dramatic collapse. The entire ice wall settled with a slow, grinding motion that sent vibrations deep into the rock. The shift caused existing fracture lines to widen and new hairline cracks to appear across the face. Small pieces started falling continuously, a steady rain of rubble that forced the climbers to keep their heads covered and their movements minimal. Tomas Varga was the first to crack. The 52-year-old Czech had been declining for hours, his oxygen consumption spiked by panic, his actions increasingly erratic. At 1:40, he insisted on climbing down, certain he could force a way through the entrance debris. Pemba tried to reason with him, explaining that the entrance wreckage was unstable, that any weight on it could trigger further collapse. But Tomas was past reasoning. He detached his lanyard from the remaining backup line and started moving toward the demolished entrance section. He made it roughly 30 feet before the rubble shifted beneath his crampons. The ice that had appeared solid was merely balanced, held in position by friction rather than structure. When it gave way, Tomas went with it, a fall that lasted several seconds before his body struck a rock outcrop hundreds of feet below and continued tumbling into the depths. Sophia made a sound, half gasp, half sob, that was swallowed by the thin air. Daniel held her, his own body trembling with adrenaline and grief. They had known Tomas for only 3 weeks, but they had shared meals with him, listened to his stories about his daughters back in Prague, and watched him battle the altitude that his aging body could no longer tolerate. Now he was gone, and they were still stuck. At 2:30, Marcus and Henrik Larsson began an attempt to reach the stranded group from above. It was a gamble. 2 men working at the edge of a fall zone that was still shedding ice. They had descended the completed section to the edge of the debris field and were trying to establish new anchor points that could support a rope line across the gap. The work was agonizingly slow. Each ice screw had to be tested, each anchor backed up, each movement weighed against the continuous small collapses from the Serac overhead. By 3:15, they had managed to fix approximately 25 feet of new rope. The gap remaining was perhaps 40 feet, close enough that the stranded climbers could see Marcus working, could hear his labored breathing over the radio. But the ice quality on the debris field was deteriorating as the afternoon sun continued its work. Every anchor Marcus placed felt marginally less reliable than the last. At 3:47, the Serac collapsed completely. The entire 300-foot wall of ice that had been hanging over the traverse broke away in a single catastrophic failure. The volume of falling ice was estimated later at approximately 12,000 cubic meters, enough to fill nearly 5 Olympic swimming pools. The sound was not a crack or a roar, but something closer to continuous thunder, a sustained detonation of noise that echoed off the surrounding peaks for nearly 30 seconds. Marcus saw it coming and threw himself backward, rolling away from the debris field as ice blocks the size of automobiles crashed down around him. He survived only because he was positioned at the extreme edge of the fall zone, partially sheltered by a rock overhang that deflected the largest pieces. The 8 climbers on the traverse had no such protection. The ice hit them with the force of a collapsing building, scouring the entire traverse clean in a matter of seconds. Fixed ropes, anchor points, equipment, and bodies were torn from the face and scattered across thousands of feet of vertical terrain. Kira Jensen survived because she had positioned herself in a crack just outside the primary fall line, wedging her body into a space too narrow for the largest blocks of ice to penetrate. She was buried beneath 3 feet of debris, a narrow void around her head and chest, just enough space to breathe and vent exhaled air. Her oxygen still flowed, the hose shielded by the crack, the regulator intact. When the avalanche passed, she started digging one-handed in short, brutal bursts, vision narrowing as pain and altitude blurred the edges of everything, her shattered left arm hanging useless at her side. Everyone else on the traverse died in the collapse. Sophia and Daniel Ruiz were swept away together, their bodies never parted, falling thousands of feet into the same void that had claimed their friends. Pemba Tshering, who had survived 16 Everest expeditions and countless perilous situations, was struck directly by a multi-ton block of ice. Karim Shah and Imran Hussain, the Pakistani porters who had cautioned against this route, died within seconds of each other. Henrik Larsson, the Swedish photographer, was crushed against the rock face while still clipped to his anchor, a camera that may have been running until the impact destroyed it. The rescue operation that followed was among the most difficult in K2's history. Marcus, despite his own injuries, managed to reach Kira's position before nightfall, getting her clipped in, insulating her body, checking her oxygen, and stabilizing her as best he could. They spent the night of August 6th huddled together on a narrow ledge at 27,400 feet, waiting for conditions to stabilize enough to begin the descent. The following morning, a team already staged lower on the route climbed up through the night and reached them. Kira was lowered down the mountain on a stretcher, improvised from climbing ropes and pack frames, a process that took 14 hours and nearly claimed 2 more lives when an anchor failed during the descent. In the months that followed, she lost 7 fingers and all of her toes to frostbite. Her climbing career ended in a single afternoon. Marcus Holt walked off the mountain on his own feet, physically intact but psychologically shattered. He had made the call to take the West Ridge Traverse. He had evaluated the conditions and deemed them acceptable. 8 people had died because of his judgment, including 2 of his own clients. The bodies on the Traverse were never recovered. The Serac collapse had left the route unrecognizable and impassable, buried under hundreds of feet of debris. Sophia and Daniel Ruiz were declared dead in absentia 6 months later, their remains entombed somewhere in the frozen depths of K2's west face. The pregnancy test Sophia had been waiting to use was found during the later cleanup of Camp 4, still sealed in its packaging. Official investigations attributed the disaster to catastrophic Serac failure triggered by solar warming. The decision to use the West Ridge Traverse was characterized as reasonable given the information available at the time, though the final report strongly discouraged any future use of the route. Marcus Holt never climbed again. He shut down his guiding company, sold his equipment, and withdrew from the mountaineering community entirely. In a single interview given 2 years after the disaster, he said that he still heard the sound of the Serac collapsing every night before he fell asleep. A sound that reminded him that some decisions cannot be taken back, and some routes lead only to places from which there is no return. It was May 14th, 2017, at the high camp on the south col of Mount Everest. Weather had been cooperative for days, with temperatures well below zero and moderate winds. Forecasts indicated good conditions for the next morning's summit attempts. Vera Thorne was 52, a physician from Ontario attempting Everest as part of a commercial expedition. She had summited other major peaks and understood high-altitude medicine well. Her expedition package included multiple oxygen bottles for summit day, plus a reserve at camp. The expedition was led by Ryan Bishop, 38, a guide with several Everest summits who ran a small guiding business. His service was priced competitively, not premium, not budget, achieved by carefully controlling expenses. What Vera and the other clients never knew was that Ryan had been collecting partially used oxygen bottles and redistributing them as full. When clients turned back early or used less oxygen than allocated, Ryan gathered their bottles and gave them to others without tracking remaining contents. The pressure gauges still showed pressure, but actual oxygen volume was significantly less. His records showed he had purchased far fewer new bottles than he had distributed, with considerable cost savings. The evening before summit day, Ryan briefed his clients. Departure was scheduled for late that night. Estimated time to the summit was most of a day, with a mandatory turnaround time of mid-morning, regardless of progress. Vera and the team left high camp near midnight. Several members were documenting the climb with helmet cameras and phones. The route followed gradual snow slopes before steepening toward the balcony. Vera reached it in the early morning hours and switched to her second bottle. The gauge on her first had run down faster than expected. She mentioned this to Ryan on camera. He suggested she was probably breathing harder than usual. By mid-morning, Vera felt sluggish at significant altitude. Ryan checked her equipment and oxygen flow. Everything appeared normal. Her second bottle gauge showed less than half remaining. He calculated she could make the summit and descend to where emergency oxygen was cached. His calculation was based on how full bottles normally performed, not accounting for the fact that hers were already partially depleted. Vera reached the difficult rock step below the summit later that morning. Her gauge was reading low. The summit was still above her. She asked Ryan if she should turn around. Focused on client success and convinced she had enough oxygen, he told her she could make it to the top and back down to the emergency supply. Vera summited. Another client photographed the celebration. Images that would later show faded markings and labels inconsistent with new equipment. Her bottle gauge was nearly empty. She took her photos and started down. Shortly into her descent, the oxygen ran out completely. She was still well above the emergency cache. Ryan, descending with another client, learned the situation via radio and told Vera to move as fast as she could. Her pace slowed dramatically. Other climbers passing her later said she was sitting frequently and seemed confused. Two climbers with helmet cameras captured her deteriorating condition during their own descent. Over the following hours, Vera covered very little distance. Ryan reached her with his own bottle running low. He shared oxygen intermittently, but had little remaining. When he called for help, no other guides were positioned to assist. Eventually, Vera stopped moving. Ryan tried to rouse her, but she was unresponsive. He kept sharing what oxygen remained until his bottle ran out entirely. A rescue team reached Vera's position early that afternoon. She had no vital signs. Ryan was severely hypothermic and required assistance getting down. The investigation that followed proved damning. Examiners found markings on Vera's bottles, indicating prior use. Summit photos showed faded labels and old expedition markings from weeks earlier. One client's helmet camera footage, filmed at high camp the night before departure, showed Ryan distributing bottles with visible wear and partially obscured labels, details no one had noticed in the dark. Another climber had filmed his oxygen setup at the balcony. His bottle showed remnants of tape with a previous client's name scratched off. Ryan's inventory system was found to be deliberately vague, listing bottles only by count rather than individual tracking. The evidence was systematic and undeniable. Vera's oxygen had depleted far earlier than it should have. Her death was attributed to oxygen deprivation during descent. Ryan's permits were permanently revoked, his company shut down, and criminal fraud charges were filed. The cameras his clients carried to document their achievement became the primary evidence of how he had endangered them all. It was January 30th, 2026. On a high-altitude glacier approach route toward a remote mountain base region, where a morning freeze had formed a deceptive snow crust that concealed weak bridges above deep crevasse fields. Melis Dorn was 29, a public school counselor from a desert city in the southwestern United States who found comfort in hiking after work. This was her first trek in a high mountain glacier environment, with no intention of attempting a summit, only to reach the base trekking camp and return along the marked route. Her mountaineering experience was limited to supervised training on smaller mountain. While taking a photograph, she stepped slightly off the flagged path, following faint boot impressions in the snow, a choice that would later prove fatal. The glacier surface consisted of broken ice fields covered by soft snow layers. Several crevasse zones ran across the approach corridor, separated by thin snow bridges that could collapse under minor pressure. Clear skies and light wind created comfortable walking conditions, but the overnight freeze had formed a brittle crust that was beginning to soften under morning sunlight. Local guides had previously warned trekkers to remain within the flagged corridor. Old probe holes marked areas where glacier teams had tested snow thickness. A faint side path, created by earlier travelers moving toward a distant ice wall, gradually diverged from the main route. Risk increased when Melis unclipped from a short handline connecting two route markers to move 3 steps rightward for a better camera angle. While adjusting her camera settings, the guide moved ahead with 2 other trekkers, leaving her briefly alone. The warning signs were subtle, with a dull, hollow sound coming from the snow beneath her last step. The surface crust suddenly fractured as Melis shifted her weight, and she fell vertically through a narrow opening in the glacier. Her backpack briefly caught on the crevasse edge, slowing the descent before the strap gave way under her weight. She struck the ice walls during the fall before landing on accumulated snow at the crevasse base. The fall lasted only moments, followed by settling sounds inside the ice chamber. Witnesses above heard a muted impact and drifting snow particles falling through the narrow opening. The guide and trekkers immediately marked the collapse location using root wands and lowered a rope in preparation for rescue. The injuries included pelvic fractures, rib fractures, and facial lacerations. Cold air trapped inside the crevasse accelerated heat loss, and progressive hypothermia developed rapidly. Mayelis remained responsive for several minutes, though her breathing gradually slowed. The combination of traumatic injury, restricted airway positioning within the narrow ice cavity, and falling core body temperature made survival impossible before extraction could be completed. The guide immediately radioed for help using VHF communication. A rope rescue team arrived after some time and spent additional time assembling a hauling system to extract her from the narrow crevasse opening, as the confined ice walls and limited equipment slowed the process. Extraction was completed after roughly 2 hours. She was first moved to a temporary camp before being carried by litter toward the main trekking staging area. Medical evaluation determined the cause of death to be traumatic asphyxia combined with blunt force injury, with hypothermia and delayed extraction contributing to the outcome. Evidence recovered included the torn backpack strap and a broken camera device, later found resting on an ice ledge about 18 feet below the surface. The incident was briefly discussed on a trekking forum and mentioned in a regional mountain community newspaper, but did not receive wider media coverage. Following the accident, the outfitter revised safety protocols to require roped travel across all glacier sections where crevasse presence was possible, even on approach routes traditionally considered low risk. It was May 3, 2017, on the standard southeast ridge route of Mount Everest. Camp 3 clung to the steep Lhotse face at 24,000 feet, a collection of tents anchored to ice ledges carved into the 50-degree slope. Claudia Beverly, 49, was part of a commercial expedition and had paid for a premium package that included dedicated Sherpa support and customized services. She worked in wealth management and had completed one previous high-altitude climb on Mount Kilimanjaro, which required no technical skills or supplemental oxygen. Beverly mentioned frequently that her premium fee entitled her to personalized attention and scheduling flexibility that standard packages did not include. During the 3-week acclimatization period, Beverly requested modifications to the climbing schedule, including later departure times and extended breakfast periods with specific meal preparations requiring separate cooking. When the expedition leader explained that everyone ate the same meals at the same time for efficiency, Beverly pointed to her package's mention of customized service. The guides accommodated her requests when possible, though this required her personal Sherpa to prepare food separately. Beverly also requested longer rest stops during climbs. During the ascent from Camp 1 to Camp 2, she stopped 6 times, each time resting for 10 to 15 minutes, causing the group to arrive at Camp 2 nearly 2 hours behind the main team. When the expedition leader noted that extended delays could create problems during the summit push, Beverly maintained she was managing her energy appropriately and understood her own physical limits. On May 2nd, the expedition leader announced a weather window opening May 4th, with summit attempts departing Camp 4 around midnight. He emphasized that all climbers needed to maintain group pace for safe descent before afternoon weather deterioration. Beverly approached him privately to argue that her premium package entitled her to climb at her own pace with dedicated Sherpa support. The leader explained that no exceptions were possible above Camp 4. Beverly did not raise the issue again, but remained visibly dissatisfied. On May 3rd, the team arrived at the South Col at 2:30 p.m. with plans to depart at 11 p.m. During the rest period, Beverly made multiple requests to her Sherpa for hand warmers, specific snacks, and adjustments to her oxygen setup, each requiring equipment to be unpacked and repacked. When the guide called for departure at 10:45 p.m., Beverly emerged 15 minutes late. The team left at 11:10 p.m., already behind schedule. Beverly climbed slowly from the start, stopping frequently. The team reached the balcony at 5:20 a.m., 50 minutes behind the planned schedule. After a brief rest, the group resumed at 5:25 a.m. Beverly stood 4 minutes later and followed. At 8:50 a.m., the team reached 28,400 feet, with the summit 600 feet above. The guide radioed base camp, and the decision was made to continue with a firm 11:30 a.m. turnaround. At 9:15 a.m., Beverly sat down on the fixed line, despite instructions to maintain pace. The guide helped her to her feet after 3 minutes. The team reached the summit at 10:45 a.m. Beverly spent 8 minutes at the top while her Sherpa photographed her. Other team members had already begun descending after 2 to 3 minutes. She started down at 10:55 a.m. Her pace slowed immediately. The 300-foot stretch between the summit and South Summit took 75 minutes, with Beverly stopping 6 times on the fixed line. By 1:40 p.m., the team was at 27,800 feet, with winds at 30 miles per hour and temperature falling to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Beverly sat down and could not continue under her own power. The guide instructed the Sherpas to short rope her, keeping a shortened length of rope between Beverly and a Sherpa to physically control her movement down the slope. At 3:50 p.m., at 27,200 feet, Beverly collapsed and could not stand even with assistance. 2 Sherpas managed to move her approximately 50 feet over 20 minutes before progress became impossible. With darkness less than 90 minutes away and the team still 1,200 feet above camp, the guide established an emergency bivouac at a small rock outcrop at 27,150 feet. At 5:10 p.m., Beverly became unresponsive. Wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour, and temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breathing stopped at 5:45 p.m. The guide and Sherpas descended through darkness using headlamps, reaching Camp 4 at 8:20 p.m., with frostbite injuries to their extremities. Beverly's body was recovered on May 8th when conditions improved. The investigation determined death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, concluding that her cumulative delays, totaling roughly 2.5 hours beyond a standard ascent, placed the team in an unrecoverable position as daylight and oxygen supplies ran out simultaneously. The report noted that the Sherpas and guide who remained with Beverly sustained serious frostbite injuries as a direct consequence of the extended time spent above 27,000 feet attempting to assist her descent. It was September 19, 2013, on the upper technical section of Mount Everest's southeast ridge. The morning was cold and still, with sunlight reflecting faintly off ice-covered rock. The route was technically demanding, with exposed terrain and unstable alpine conditions common at high altitude. Javier Cruz was 31, a rock climbing instructor from the western United States who had built a reputation for pursuing speed ascents on major mountains. Over several years, she had attempted rapid climbs across multiple alpine regions, emphasizing endurance and technical efficiency. Observers described her as highly skilled, but willing to push traditional safety margins in pursuit of record pacing. Her objective on Everest was to complete the upper technical ridge segment faster than the existing recorded speed attempt, prioritizing pace over extended acclimatization pauses. The route she chose crossed a steep section of mixed ice and rock terrain above the highest established camp zones. Although technically passable, the area required careful movement due to exposure to high winds and loose surface material. Expedition forecasts warned that afternoon thunderstorms were possible along the higher Himalayan ridges, a pattern occasionally observed during seasonal atmospheric instability. Bypass several recommended protection placements along the ridge. Instead of maintaining full rope security systems in exposed sections, she advanced using direct free climbing movement to reduce time spent stationary. By mid-morning, she had reached the upper headwall section, while remaining ahead of her projected schedule. At approximately 28,000 feet, Cruz began free soloing the final exposed wall segment leading toward the summit approach zone. During this period, cloud formations thickened across the western Himalayan horizon, and atmospheric electrical activity increased. The first lightning discharge was observed striking near the upper mountain shortly afterward. Despite visible storm development and rising electrical tension in the surrounding air, she continued climbing. Guides and nearby climbers later reported that descending to shelter was recommended, but she maintained upward movement to preserve record pace objectives. While reaching for a handhold near the middle section of the final headwall, a lightning strike struck the summit zone, releasing an electrical discharge that spread across moisture-coated granite and ice surfaces. The mountain rock, covered by thin layers of frozen condensation, allowed the current to travel along natural conductive paths on the cliff face. The sudden electrical shock caused Cruz to lose muscle control and grip strength, forcing her hand away from the rock hold. Immediately after losing her grip, she fell approximately 150 feet and struck a projecting granite ledge. The impact produced severe blunt force trauma and momentarily altered her fall trajectory, causing her body to rebound away from the ledge before continuing downward. She then entered a steep couloir filled with fractured ice, loose rock fragments, and irregular surface projections. During the uncontrolled descent, repeated collisions with rock and ice structures increased injury severity as momentum accelerated the fall along the narrow mountain channel. Climbers on nearby routes witnessed the lightning strike and fall and immediately relayed emergency alerts to base camp. However, ongoing electrical activity in the storm system prevented helicopter rescue due to high-altitude turbulence and lightning risk. Recovery teams reached the location after weather conditions stabilized several hours later. Cruz was found at the base of the couloir, about 450 feet below her last position. Medical examination confirmed massive blunt force trauma from repeated impacts during the fall, with burn patterns on equipment and hands consistent with electrical discharge exposure. Expedition records showed she was about 20 minutes ahead of the informal speed benchmark for that ridge segment. The incident later became a reference in mountaineering safety discussions, demonstrating how pursuit of speed records can increase exposure to environmental hazards. On Everest's upper ridges, thin air, sudden storms, and exposed terrain can quickly turn small timing decisions into fatal outcomes. And in the death zone, physical strength alone does not eliminate environmental risk. It was September 3rd, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skylar Pemberton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness, and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes. Distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. By September 14, 2015, in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia, the afternoon heat had settled into the valley, and the sandstone cliffs glowed orange in the late sun. A section of wall known locally as Cathedral Ledge had been fenced off for nearly 4 years, ever since a series of unexpected rockfalls had killed one climber and injured 2 others. Rangers had installed permanent barriers, posted warning signs in 3 languages, and added motion-activated cameras after reports of trespassers. The closure wasn't a suggestion. It was a legal prohibition backed by fines and potential prosecution. But 26-year-old Marcus Ellison had never let signs stop him before. He was a gym climber from Sydney who had transitioned to outdoor bouldering 2 years earlier, building a small following on social media by posting videos of himself on routes other climbers avoided. His style was aggressive and photogenic, heavy on dramatic angles and light on safety gear. Friends described him as charming but reckless, someone who treated risk as content rather than consequence. Marcus had driven to the Blue Mountains that morning with a plan. He wanted footage of himself free soloing a route on Cathedral Ledge, a climb that would be impossible to replicate legally and therefore impossible for anyone else to match. The closure made it more attractive, not less. He parked at a pullout nearly a mile from the main viewing area and hiked through the scrub to approach the cliff from an angle the cameras couldn't cover. The sandstone at Cathedral Ledge was ancient and weathered, shaped by millions of years of wind and water into features that looked solid but often weren't. The rock was layered, with thin bands of harder material sandwiched between softer stone that crumbled under pressure. Water seeped into invisible seams during storms, dried, and left the bonds between layers weaker each season. Climbers who had worked the wall before the closure knew to test every hold twice and avoid any feature that looked flaky or hollow. Marcus had never climbed sandstone of this type. His experience was limited to granite boulders and plastic gym holds, surfaces that behaved predictably and rarely failed without warning. He reached the base of the cliff around 3 in the afternoon. The wall rose nearly 200 feet above him, its surface broken by horizontal cracks and shallow ledges. A faded sign wired to the fence warned of unstable rock and prohibited all climbing activity. Marcus ducked under the barrier, set up his camera on a small tripod, and began chalking his hands. He wore no harness, carried no rope, and had told no one where he was going. The only precaution he had taken was leaving his car unlocked in case someone needed to retrieve his belongings. The first 30 feet went smoothly. The holds were larger than expected, and Marcus moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent years training indoors. He paused briefly on a ledge at 40 feet to shake out his arms and glance down at the camera below. The angle was perfect. From that height, the valley stretched out behind him in layers of green and gold, a view that would have been worth the climb if the rock had been reliable. Above the ledge, the rock changed character. The sandstone became visibly more weathered, with pale streaks running down the face where water had eroded softer layers. Several holds that looked solid from below turned out to be hollow, producing a dull thud when Marcus tested them. He adjusted his line, moving left toward a vertical crack that split the upper wall. At 70 feet, Marcus ran into the first serious problem. A foothold crumbled the instant he weighted it, sending a shower of orange dust down the cliff. He caught himself by jamming his hand deeper into the crack, but the movement cost him balance. He spent several seconds pressed flat against the wall, breathing hard. A wiser climber would have recognized the warning. Marcus saw it as a challenge. He continued upward. The crack narrowed as he climbed, forcing him to switch from hand jams to finger locks. His forearms began to burn. At 90 feet, he reached for a horizontal edge that would allow him to rest. The edge looked solid, a clean line of darker stone that protruded slightly from the surrounding rock. He wrapped his fingers over it and pulled. The hold came off in his hand. Not a small piece, but the entire edge, a slab of sandstone roughly the size of a dinner plate that had been attached to the cliff by nothing more than friction. The failure was instant and total. Marcus's weight shifted backward as his grip vanished, and his other hand couldn't compensate fast enough. His body peeled away from the wall in a slow, almost graceful arc. He fell without a sound. The camera captured everything. His body rotated once in the air before striking a ledge at 40 feet, then continued tumbling to the ground. When rangers discovered him the following morning, after a hiker reported an abandoned camera near the closed section, Marcus was lying face down in the scree, his chalk bag still clipped to his waist. The investigation was brief. The failed hold revealed a network of internal fractures invisible from the surface. The rock had been poised to fail for years. After his death, rangers extended the restricted zone and installed additional barriers. It was April 9, 2016, on the southern approach to Mount Everest in Nepal. Pre-season preparations were well underway. Teams of specialists had been installing ladders across crevasses and anchoring safety lines through the ice. The work was technical and hazardous. Anders Frost was 33, working as a safety coordinator for a large expedition outfitter. He had spent 2 previous seasons on Everest in logistics and had presented credentials in technical rope systems and anchor assessment. His job was to inspect rope installations and verify they met safety standards before clients used them. What was never verified was that Anders had not completed his certification training. He had attended an introductory course but never passed the final examination. His understanding of proper assessment was incomplete. To save time, Anders had been filing reports claiming installations met specifications while skipping thorough checks. One section of the icefall route involved a crevasse crossing using aluminum ladders lashed together across the gap. The ladder system was secured with anchor systems on both ends, ice screws and pickets designed to hold under stress. Anders was supposed to inspect this crossing, verify anchor integrity, and document it met safety standards before clearing it for clients. Anders arrived at the crossing with a camera to photograph the installation, standard protocol. He took several photos, then filed paperwork, stating it met all requirements. In reality, he had not tested anchor points, assessed ice quality, or verified load capacity. His time-stamped photos showed he spent less than 8 minutes at the site. After Anders cleared the route, it opened for climbers heading up to acclimatize. Early that morning, a group approached the ladder crossing. Several were filming their ascent. Ian Bridges, 29, a client from Colorado on his first Everest attempt, clipped his safety line to the fixed rope and started across. Ian was about halfway when there was a sharp crack from the anchor point. Climbers on both sides had cameras running, capturing the rope suddenly going slack, then snapping tight. The anchor system had started to fail. Some anchor points had pulled free from the compromised ice. The remaining anchors held temporarily, but the rope angle changed and the ladders shifted. Ian lost his balance and grabbed the rope. His jerking weight put extra stress on what remained. Another crack followed. More anchors pulled out. The ladder system tilted sharply. Ian was still attached by his safety tether, but the final anchor points could not hold everything. They ripped free. The entire anchor failed. Multiple cameras captured the ladders dropping into the crevasse, held only by the far anchor. Ian, still clipped in, swung hard into the crevasse wall. Rescue efforts started immediately. Climbers on the far side tried to haul Ian up using the rope, but the far anchor was now supporting weight it had not been designed to handle alone. The far anchor started to slip under the unexpected load. The rope dropped several feet before catching again. Ian was now deep in the crevasse, hanging from a stress system. Radio calls went out for rescue equipment. A team with proper gear was dispatched from base camp, but would need considerable time to arrive. Before the rescue team could reach the location, the carabiner connecting Ian's tether to the rope failed under sustained stress and cold conditions. He fell further onto an ice ledge inside the crevasse. Rescue specialists reached the crevasse by mid-morning and rappelled down to Ian. He was already dead. His body was brought out later that day. Physical inspection of the failed anchor revealed serious issues with the installation Anders had cleared as safe. The ice quality was marginal and should have been flagged. Technical experts compared Anders's inspection photos against what proper documentation required. His images showed only wide-angle shots of the crossing, with no close-ups of individual anchor points, ice quality assessment, or load testing evidence. The metadata confirmed he had taken 6 photos over 7 minutes, then left. Video footage from climbers who witnessed the failure was analyzed alongside Anders's photos. The videos clearly showed anchor configurations and ice conditions that any trained inspector would have identified as inadequate. One climber's footage, shot hours before the crossing opened, showed the soft, sun-affected ice Anders should have flagged. His documentation showed he had spent insufficient time for thorough assessment and had photographed the crossing from distances that concealed the problems. The expedition company suspended operations and brought in independent experts to reassess every section Anders had cleared. Multiple other crossings were found with similar problems, all with Anders's cursory photo documentation. His certification documents trace back to incomplete training with no accreditation. It was January 24th, 2026, on a high-altitude section of a remote 8,000-meter mountain, between a steep ice couloir and an exposed traverse zone. The air was extremely thin, slowing movement and decision-making, while clipped breathing echoed faintly against surrounding ice walls. Ilara Boone was 36, an intensive care nurse from a mountain city in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. Working in critical care had trained her to remain calm under pressure and respond quickly to emergencies. She approached climbing with discipline and endurance training. Teammates described her as determined once she committed to an objective. She had prior experience on a high mountain above 7,000 meters, but limited exposure to extreme altitude zones where oxygen scarcity strongly affects cognition. Her goal was to reach the summit and descend to a mid-high camp the same day. During the climb, teammates noticed early warning signs of altitude stress, including slower speech and reduced reaction speed. One teammate suggested turning back near the narrow passage beneath a massive overhanging ice structure, where exposure risk was high. Ilara chose to continue, using minimal supplemental oxygen to conserve supply for the descent. The terrain consisted of a steep ice couloir, followed by a narrow exposed traverse where protection anchors were spaced widely. Light cloud cover created flat lighting conditions, reducing depth perception and making it difficult to distinguish solid ice from thin snow layer. At extreme altitude, hypoxia impairs judgment, coordination, and reaction speed. The flat light further hid small surface irregularities that climbers normally use for secure footing. Another team had advised early retreat as cloud cover thickened. Warning signs included slower clipping movements and a brief misclip of a carabiner that required correction after a teammate's reminder. Risk increased when an oxygen cylinder swap was delayed, leaving Ilara on reduced oxygen flow during a critical section. Despite assistance offers, she chose to descend under her own movement rather than use short rope support. The accident occurred near the middle of the traverse beneath the Serac. As Ilara stepped to bypass an old anchor, the front points of her left crampon slid across a thin snow layer resting on hard ice. Hypoxia affected her hand control while handling the ascender. She briefly unweighted the fixed line, slid a short distance downhill, and attempted to regain grip. The ascender re-engaged at an unstable angle before detaching under load. Her ice axe failed to arrest the motion as the pick skidded across hard ice without penetrating. She slid diagonally across the slope, struck a protruding ice bulge, and continued sliding toward lower terrain near the couloir lip. The uncontrolled movement covered about 100 feet in less than 10 seconds. Scraping metal, short exhalations, and muted shouts were heard by nearby teammates. 2 climbers witnessed the fall sequence. Helmet camera footage later reviewed at base camp captured the misclip and loss of control. The impact caused head trauma, an upper arm fracture, and suspected internal bleeding. Brief involuntary convulsions were followed by agonal breathing lasting less than a minute. Severe brain injury combined with extreme altitude conditions made recovery impossible. Teammates immediately radioed the main base staging area. Communication was maintained through relay channels and satellite notification to expedition coordinators. No external rescue team could reach the site that day due to terrain exposure and avalanche risk beneath the Serac. Team members carefully moved her about 40 feet to a more protected stand. Helicopter evacuation was not feasible inside the confined ice corridor. Her body was later transported down the route during safer seasonal conditions to the base staging area. Medical review identified blunt force head trauma as the primary cause of death, with contributing factors including hypoxia-related impairment, low oxygen flow during the traverse, and flat-like conditions hiding terrain edges. Recovered evidence included a damaged helmet and video footage showing the misclipped sequence. The incident was briefly mentioned in specialized climbing summaries. Following the accident, expedition groups added redundant attachment systems at exposed traverse anchors to reduce single-point failure risk. It was April 23, 2013, at Everest Base Camp in Nepal. Climbers moved between expedition camps in the late morning, some preparing for rotations while others rested after descending. The Khumbu Icefall loomed above, a chaotic maze of ice blocks and crevasses marking the route to Camp 1. Rosalind Fletcher, 43, worked as a corporate attorney and had signed up for a commercial Everest expedition after completing several weekend hiking trips in Colorado. On her application, she listed experience on 3 peaks above 14,000 feet and described herself as an experienced alpine hiker with basic technical skills suitable for guided expeditions. During the initial team meeting, the expedition leader reviewed each climber's background. When asked specific questions about crampons, ice axes, and fixed rope systems, Fletcher gave general answers suggesting familiarity without concrete examples. The leader noted her responses but did not press further, as all clients would undergo skills training during acclimatization. On the first rotation to Camp 1, Fletcher struggled with the ladder crossings over crevasses in the Khumbu Icefall. She required multiple attempts to clip and unclip her safety tethers at each junction and moved significantly slower than the rest of the group. Her crampon points caught on the ladder rungs twice, causing her to freeze mid-crossing. When the guide asked about her mountaineering course, Fletcher said it had covered the basics and she just needed practice. During the second rotation to Camp 2, her technique remained poor. She frequently attached her ascender backwards or failed to properly lock the cam, requiring repeated correction from guides. Her crampon work on steep ice showed poor front-pointing form, causing excessive arm fatigue. The expedition leader recommended additional practice before the next rotation. Fletcher insisted she was improving and would be ready for the summit push, mentioning the significant money and time away from her law practice she had invested. On May 15th, the expedition moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet for the final acclimatization rotation. The route climbed the Lhotse Face, a steep ice wall requiring continuous rope work and front point technique on slopes averaging 50 to 60 degrees. Fletcher departed Camp 2 at 6 a.m. with the group. Within a few hours, she had fallen 100 feet behind, her inefficient technique requiring excessive effort with each step. By mid-morning, she had stopped twice on small ledges to rest. Her pace slowed to roughly 50 feet every 15 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., at 23,400 feet, Fletcher began coughing. The fits continued and worsened with exertion. The guide radioed the expedition leader and recommended immediate descent to Camp 2. Fletcher refused, stating she had invested too much time and money to turn back during a training rotation. She stood and continued climbing. By 2:15 p.m., her coughing had intensified dramatically, stopping her every few steps. Pink-tinged frothy sputum appeared at the corners of her mouth. The guide recognized this as high-altitude pulmonary edema and radioed an emergency. Within minutes, Fletcher was unable to stand without support, her breathing wet and gurgling. The guide clipped a short tether from his harness to hers and began lowering her down the fixed line. At 2:40 p.m., Fletcher lost consciousness. The guide continued the descent for 30 minutes, making minimal progress against her dead weight on the steep face. 2 Sherpas ascending from Camp 2 reached them at 3:10 p.m. The 3 worked together to move Fletcher down the Lhotse Face, alternating between lowering her on the rope and short roping across less steep sections. At 4:20 p.m., at 22,400 feet, 1 Sherpa checked for a pulse and found none. Her lips and face had turned bluish. They continued moving her body down to Camp 2, arriving at 6:50 p.m. exhausted. A guide with wilderness medical training confirmed she had died from pulmonary edema. The investigation reviewed Fletcher's performance records and contacted the mountaineering school listed on her application. The school confirmed she had completed only a weekend introductory course, not a comprehensive technical program. Her Colorado climbs were verified as standard hiking trails, requiring no ropes or crampons. Medical analysis concluded her poor technique forced her body to work 2 to 3 times harder than a skilled climber on the same terrain, triggering acute pulmonary edema. Her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared at 12:30 p.m. eliminated the window when descent might have reversed the condition. It was August 3, 2016, on the technical north face of Mount Everest's western alpine region. The route was typically climbed over multiple days using established protection systems. But that morning, a climber attempted an untested direct variation that had never been completed before. Miranda Deza was 29, a software engineer from a mountain city in the western United States with 8 years of rock and alpine climbing experience. She had completed multiple Grade 4 routes in regional mountain ranges and was regarded as technically skilled on exposed vertical terrain. Friends described her as precise with anchor placement and efficient in lead climbing, but increasingly interested in speed ascents and unconventional variations that reduce dependence on established routes. Her objective was to establish a new direct line up Everest's north face sector by bypassing the traditional traverse section designed to avoid fractured rock zones. The proposed path crossed a band of granite that expedition reconnaissance notes had previously described as highly unstable due to block fragmentation. Several experienced climbers had inspected the variation line in earlier seasons and declined to attempt it because of unreliable protection opportunities. The North Face corridor rises through steep mixed rock and ice terrain. The orientation of the wall limits early sunlight exposure, allowing overnight freeze conditions to persist on surface holds. In the week prior to the climb, repeated freeze-thaw cycles had increased rockfall reports along north-facing sections of the mountain. Local mountain safety authorities issued advisories warning about loose block movement in that zone. Deza's usual climbing partner declined to attempt the direct variation due to instability concerns. She chose to climb alone. At approximately early morning, she was observed leaving the base camp zone carrying minimal gear, a light rack of protection devices, a single rope system, and equipment suitable for a planned single-day ascent. By mid-morning, she had bypassed the first established belay station, confirming commitment to the untested line. Climbers on a neighboring route later reported seeing her moving cautiously but steadily through the lower pitches. Several hours into the ascent, she reached a zone roughly midway up the face where solid granite transitioned into stacked, fractured rock blocks. The route required traversing left across a loose rock band to reconnect with a more stable vertical crack system. Observers using binoculars from lower valley observation points noted that she spent extended time testing each potential handhold before committing weight. Movement appeared deliberate, with repeated repositioning to confirm stability. Around late morning, while transferring body weight onto a large rock block during the traverse, the structure suddenly detached from the wall. The block, later estimated to be roughly refrigerator-sized, broke free without warning. Its movement triggered additional rock displacement above the climbing line, producing a cascading debris fall across a wide section of the face. Deza fell approximately several dozen feet before her rope system caught on a natural granite protrusion below. The catch prevented a longer uncontrolled fall, but left her suspended directly below the unstable zone. During the rockfall cascade, multiple fragments struck her helmet and upper body. Investigators later determined that at least one large rock impact struck her head region, while additional debris impacted her torso and shoulders. Climbers below immediately contacted emergency services. However, continuing rockfall activity delayed helicopter response because rotor airflow could have destabilized loose rock above the site. A technical ground rescue team began ascending through the same unstable terrain. Rescuers reached the location several hours later, but she was unresponsive and was pronounced dead during the rescue operation, despite stabilization attempts. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be severe traumatic brain and internal injuries from multiple rock impacts, with helmet damage consistent with high-force collision. Following the incident, mountain safety advisories were updated to warn against direct variation attempts on Everest's north face. Expedition guides emphasize that freeze-thaw rock instability creates objective hazards that cannot be overcome by technical skill alone. Personal records recovered from her gear indicated she was aware of the loose rock zone, but chose to continue the attempt. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. Guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. On the morning of March 22, 2017, the south side of Mount Hood in Oregon sat locked down. The upper mountain had been shut for 3 days due to unstable snow and sustained winds gusting above 50 miles per hour. Timberline climbing rangers had posted bright orange closure signs at every major access point, and the morning weather briefing warned of refrozen ice on the higher slopes and active icefall in the Pearly Gates Chute. Temperatures had plummeted overnight, turning soft spring snow into a brittle shell that fractured underfoot. For most climbers checking conditions that week, the decision to stay off the mountain required no deliberation. But 29-year-old Ryan Caldwell wasn't most climbers. He had driven up from Portland before dawn, pulling into the Timberline parking lot just after 4 in the morning. Ryan had cultivated a modest following on social media by documenting solo climbs on Pacific Northwest volcanoes, often bragging about slipping past closure signs and reaching summits when others turned back. His online persona thrived on the notion that official warnings were meant for tourists and weekend hikers, not serious climbers like himself. Friends described a pattern of escalating risks, each successful climb reinforcing his conviction that caution was optional. He had summited Mount Hood once before, 2 summers earlier, under clear skies and soft snow. That single ascent had convinced him he understood the mountain. What he didn't grasp was how drastically conditions could shift between seasons, or how little his summer experience would count on early spring ice. His pack that morning held a single aluminum ice axe, lightweight crampons designed for moderate terrain, and no self-rescue gear. Rangers who later examined his equipment noted it was suited for a casual glacier walk, not the rock-hard ice waiting above the tree line. Ryan passed the closure signs without breaking stride. A pair of skiers preparing gear near their vehicle watched him step over the barrier and continue up the trail, his headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the pre-dawn darkness. One of them called out, asking if he knew the route was closed. Ryan raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't stop. Within minutes, his light had disappeared into the trees above the parking lot. The skiers watched until his beam vanished, then exchanged a glance without speaking, assuming he would turn back once he encountered the conditions firsthand. The lower slopes passed without incident. By the time the sun crept over the ridge to the east, he had cleared the tree line and was approaching the Hog's Back, a narrow spine of snow that funneled climbers toward the summit crater. The wind had eased slightly, but the surface beneath his feet told a different story. Every step produced a hollow, almost metallic sound, the unmistakable sign of a deep freeze that had transformed the snow into something closer to ice. A guided group resting near the top of the Palmer snowfield spotted him moving alone far above their position. Their guide later recalled watching Ryan climb in a straight line up the steepest sections, bypassing the safer switchback tracks left by previous teams. His pace looked aggressive, almost rushed, as if he were racing against something no one else could see. The guide made a mental note of the time and continued preparing his clients for their own descent. By mid-morning, Ryan had reached the base of the Pearly Gates, a narrow chute carved between 2 unstable rock buttresses that led directly to the summit crater. The chute had been specifically cited in the closure advisory. Warm afternoon temperatures earlier in the week had loosened ice from the upper walls, and rangers had documented fresh debris scattered across the approach. Climbing through the gates during unstable conditions was considered one of the most dangerous decisions a person could make on Mount Hood. The freeze-thaw cycle had worked on the upper walls for days. Daytime warmth expanding fractures, overnight cold, refreezing moisture, and widening cracks until slabs hung by friction alone. Ryan paused at the entrance and looked up. The walls rose steeply on either side, their surfaces streaked with old ice and loose rock. A faint groaning sound echoed from somewhere above, the kind of noise that experienced alpinists recognize as a warning. For a long moment, Ryan stood motionless, his breath clouding in the cold air. Then he stepped forward and began climbing into the chute, committing himself to a route that every official source had declared off-limits. The first 50 feet went smoothly. His crampons found purchase on the hard ice, and his axe bit cleanly into the surface with each swing. The wind funneled through the chute, driving loose snow sideways and reducing visibility to short bursts between gusts. He didn't notice the thin crack spreading through the ice above him, or the way the morning sun had begun warming the eastern wall. The collapse happened without warning. A slab of ice roughly the size of a car door sheared away from the upper wall and dropped straight down the chute. Ryan heard the crack a fraction of a second before impact. He tried to flatten himself against the slope, but the falling ice struck the surface beside him with enough force to shatter into frozen shrapnel. One fragment caught his shoulder and spun him sideways. His axe ripped free, and his crampons lost their grip simultaneously. He began sliding immediately. The surface was too hard, too polished by wind and cold to offer any purchase. His body accelerated down the chute, tumbling once before straightening into a head-first slide. Witnesses below saw a dark shape emerge from the gates and continue down the slope at terrifying speed. there was no attempt to self-arrest. The ice simply wouldn't permit it. Ryan's body struck a rock outcrop near the base of the chute and continued sliding until it disappeared over a roll in the terrain. The rescue team reached him within 90 minutes. He was found nearly 600 feet below the pearly gates, his body partially buried in wind-drifted snow. The injuries were consistent with a high-speed fall on alpine ice, massive blunt force trauma, multiple fractures, and no signs of life. The investigation confirmed what witnesses had described. Ryan had entered a closed road, climbed through a chute under active icefall conditions, and fallen when unstable ice gave way above him. It was April 27, 2013, at Everest Base Camp on the southern Nepal approach. Base Camp sat at an elevation where altitude sickness was common, and each expedition company was required to have medical coverage on site. Seth Austin was 31, hired as the primary medic for a mid-sized expedition, managing a dozen clients. His resume listed wilderness emergency medical certification and high-altitude medicine training. He had provided references from previous overseas work and copies of credential documents. The company, working within a limited budget, had checked his references but never verified the credentials through issuing organizations. What they never discovered was that Seth had not completed legitimate medical certification. He had volunteered with a ski patrol doing basic first aid and completed a weekend wilderness course, but had fabricated the advanced qualifications. His knowledge of altitude illness came from internet research and observation. He had worked one season at a base camp on a different mountain, where his duties had been limited to treating blisters, dispensing pain medication, and monitoring basic symptoms. Seth's responsibilities included evaluating clients for altitude sickness, determining if climbers were healthy enough to go higher, and managing medical emergencies. He had access to oxygen, altitude medications, and other equipment, but his understanding of proper protocols and dosing was incomplete. The day before the incident, a client named Paul Douglas, 47, returned from a climb to the first camp complaining of headache, fatigue, and nausea, common complaints at altitude. Seth evaluated him and concluded it was a normal adjustment to elevation, recommending rest and hydration. By that evening, Paul's headache had worsened. He returned to the medical area. Seth checked his oxygen levels, low but not unusual for base camp, gave him pain medication, and told him to keep resting. Standard procedure for worsening symptoms at that elevation included supplemental oxygen and careful monitoring for serious altitude illness. Seth provided neither, deciding Paul's condition was moderate. The next morning, Paul's tent mate found him barely responsive. He had been sick during the night, and his breathing was irregular. The tent mate ran for Seth. Seth reached Paul's tent within minutes. Paul was semi-conscious, breathing fast and shallow, with a blue tint to his lips, a visible sign of severe oxygen deprivation. Nearby climbers, some already filming their base camp experience, captured the emergency response. What the footage captured was telling. Seth put Paul on oxygen but didn't perform a proper assessment or check vital signs systematically. He radioed the expedition leader, saying Paul was ill but failed to convey the severity. Over the next half hour, Paul's condition continued to deteriorate. A medic from a neighboring expedition, hearing the commotion, came to help. The cameras caught the moment he arrived and immediately took control, his quick, systematic assessment contrasting sharply with Seth's hesitant movements. He asked Seth if he had administered emergency altitude medications. The footage clearly recorded Seth's response. He said he had not, explaining he thought Paul had a stomach problem. The second medic's visible disbelief was captured on camera as he quickly gave the necessary medication and began coordinating a helicopter evacuation. Paul's oxygen levels were dangerously low. The second medic placed him in a portable pressure chamber to simulate lower elevation while they waited for the helicopter. Video showed Seth standing to the side, helping only when directed, while the other medic worked efficiently. The contrast was stark. The helicopter arrived and Paul was loaded aboard. Radio communication during the flight brought worsening news. Paul was deteriorating despite oxygen and medication. He lost consciousness during transport. The helicopter reached the medical facility, but Paul was declared dead shortly after landing. The investigation that followed drew heavily on the video evidence captured by base camp witnesses. Recordings showed Seth had failed to recognize and treat severe altitude sickness during the crucial window when intervention could have mattered. The footage documented his failure to perform proper assessments, his inability to recognize obvious warning signs, and the moment a real medical professional arrived and immediately identified what Seth had missed. When the company requested verification of Seth's certifications after reviewing the footage, he could not produce them. The organization listed on his resume had no record of him. His references confirmed he had only ever worked limited first aid roles. The documents were fabricated. Medical experts concluded early intervention would have significantly improved Paul's chances of survival. Seth faced criminal charges for fraud and practicing without credentials. The cameras that climbers had brought to document their adventure became the record of how his deception had proven fatal. It was February 7, 2026, at a high-altitude camp platform along a remote 8,000-meter mountain route. Gusts had been building for several hours, pulling at tent fabric and creating a low humming sound through guy lines anchored into frozen snow. Tycho Raymer was 41, an HVAC installer from a cold northern city in the United States. His work with heating and cooling systems gave him familiarity with airflow and pressure movement, and he often compared mountain wind behavior to industrial ventilation. He had prior experience climbing ice during winter seasons and had successfully reached the summit of one major high-altitude mountain in North America. Teammates described him as strong during load carries, but sometimes impatient when fatigue accumulated. Tycho was part of a guided expedition preparing for a summit attempt during a predicted weather window. His objective was to rest at the high camp platform overnight and move upward with the team the following day. The camp consisted of narrow snow terraces cut into a steep slope, with long exposure to open air on the outer edge. Wind speeds were increasing through the evening, with gusts strong enough to shake anchored equipment. Ambient temperature remained well below freezing, accompanied by blowing spindrift that reduced visibility. Guides had advised doubling guy lines and clipping into fixed camp anchors while resting inside tents. Several nearby climbers reinforced their shelters after observing a tent corner lift briefly during an earlier gust. Tycho placed his two-person tent near the platform edge, using only 2 snow pickets instead of the recommended 4. He also chose not to clip his personal tether to the camp anchor system while resting. Stronger gusts struck the camp platform. Guy lines across multiple tents tightened audibly under wind stress, and Tycho's front line began vibrating sharply as it rubbed against its anchor. Instead of adding more anchors or securing himself inside the camp system, he tightened only one front line and lay down. Spindrift accumulated along the windward side, gradually increasing structural load and changing airflow around the tent surface. The accident occurred near the outer edge of the platform around 1:41 a.m. A strong gust struck the windward picket, which either snapped or pulled free from compacted snow. The tent shifted several feet toward the edge. As Tycho attempted to brace inside, a second powerful gust lifted the windward side. Remaining guy lines cut into softened snow under increasing tension. The tent slid over the platform lip, while Tycho, unconnected to any anchor, was carried with it. The tent tumbled down slope, briefly catching on a rock projection before continuing into a steep ice slope. The initial slide crossed the platform edge within seconds, followed by a longer, uncontrolled descent across snow and ice. Flapping fabric and cracking tent poles were heard above the wind. 2 teammates observed a headlamp glow, moving downslope before disappearing. The tent was located at first light on a lower slope section after multiple impacts. Medical evaluation indicated severe blunt force trauma to the head and neck, along with multiple fractures of the femur and ribs. No rope arrest occurred. Tycho was unresponsive when reached and showed no spontaneous breathing. The combination of traumatic injuries and extreme altitude made survival impossible. The team radioed their logistics camp immediately. High-altitude porters prepared recovery movement once daylight improved visibility. Communication was maintained through VHF radio and later relay channel. Several hours passed before safe ascent conditions allowed retrieval operations. Helicopter evacuation was impossible due to terrain and altitude. The body was secured mid-slope and lowered to the lower camp platform, then transported to the base staging area the following day. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force head and cervical spine trauma. Contributing factors included anchor failure, lack of personal tethering, and extreme camp exposure. Recovered evidence included the pulled picket, abraded guy lines, and fractured tent poles, consistent with high-impact loading. The expedition group later required multiple anchor systems and mandatory personal clip-in procedures at exposed high camp. It was June 8, 2014, on the upper glacier route of Mount Everest above the high camps. At approximately 14,200 feet, a climber was moving along a heavily traveled summit corridor, known for thin air, crevasse exposure, and rapidly changing Himalayan weather. What began as a summit attempt soon turned into a medical emergency in the death zone. Penelope Love was 38, a fitness trainer from Seattle who believed physical conditioning could overcome high-altitude limitations. She had completed several lower elevation climbs in the Pacific Northwest, including Mount Baker and Mount Hood, but had never climbed above 11,000 feet before attempting Everest. Acquaintances described her as highly confident in endurance training, but dismissive of high-altitude physiology. She reportedly referred to altitude sickness as a mind-over-body problem rather than a medical condition. Her objective was to reach the summit in 3 days instead of following the recommended multi-day acclimatization schedule commonly used on Everest. The route required an ascent of roughly 9,000 feet from base areas to the upper mountain zones, where atmospheric oxygen levels dropped to nearly half of sea level concentration. Above 10,000 feet, rapid ascent can trigger high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition caused by fluid accumulation and swelling inside brain tissue under oxygen deprivation. Climbing guides stationed at a mid-mountain camp observed Love developing early symptoms of altitude illness. Reports indicated she complained of persistent headache and nausea, but continued climbing after taking repeated doses of over-the-counter pain medication. Guides advised spending an additional day acclimatizing before moving higher, but she declined, stating she felt physically strong enough to continue. Other climbers moving along the same route later reported seeing Love walking unsteadily across exposed glacier sections. Witnesses described moments of slowed reaction time, occasional confusion, and difficulty maintaining stable balance on uneven ice. Her climbing partner attempted to encourage descent after noticing behavioral changes consistent with altitude impairment, but Love insisted that fatigue was the only issue. Near the final approach zone toward the upper summit corridor, Love suddenly collapsed and began vomiting repeatedly. Her partner attempted to assist her toward lower elevation, but neurological symptoms worsened quickly. Observed behavior was consistent with severe high-altitude cerebral edema, including disorientation, agitation, and loss of coordination. Shortly afterward, she lost consciousness. Emergency descent procedures were initiated by her partner, who attempted basic life support while moving downhill. During the descent, Love experienced seizure-like muscle contractions as brain swelling likely increased intracranial pressure. Her breathing became irregular and eventually stopped despite continued resuscitation attempts. The time between collapse and cardiopulmonary failure was estimated at roughly 2 hours. Terrain difficulty, extreme altitude, and physical exhaustion limited emergency response effectiveness. Helicopter evacuation was attempted, but thin air density, strong winds, and mountain topography prevented aircraft access to the high elevation zone. Ground rescue personnel reached the location after conditions stabilized. Love was pronounced dead at approximately 13,800 feet elevation. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be high-altitude cerebral edema, with brain swelling causing respiratory failure. Post-mortem analysis confirmed advanced HACE progression, and investigators noted that early warning symptoms such as headache, vomiting, irritability, and coordination loss were present but were not acted upon. The case became part of mountaineering safety education materials, reinforcing that physical fitness cannot prevent altitude-related medical failure. In the Everest death zone, the human body operates near physiological limits regardless of training level. As Penelope Love's accident demonstrated the speed at which altitude sickness can progress, another climber in a distant mountain range was approaching a summit zone where environmental hazards would soon test the boundary between endurance and survival.